Well, hello, free people of the Rocky Mountain region, and welcome to this Free State Colorado video. Today, I'm joined by Jacob Luria, the campaigns director for the Libertarian Party of Colorado. Well, Jacob, I hope you are well, and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Brandon. It's nice to be here.
Well, Jacob, the Libertarian Party of Colorado board made history recently with their partnership with the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. campaign. Now, part of this agreement was the presidential pledge signed by Robert F. Kennedy, in which he agreed to libertarian principles. So, so far, first question, what's the response been like to this RFK partnership?
Um, it's been all over the board. I think overall, though, most people are pretty excited. I will say this. Um, Most really big Trump and Biden people haven't paid attention. All of the Kennedy people are very excited. We've received a lot of excitement from our own members of our own party in our own state, and then we have, of course, faced our critics. I think we have faced way more criticism from outside of the state than inside of the state. And honestly, we can sort of talk about this later, just the general involvement of the LP. We have 45,000 registered members, 38 of which are really active in every election. Um, and I think it would be generous to say maybe 0.025% of people have even reached out about this, all of which, most of which are supportive. But, it seems like the Kennedy campaign in general has gotten more support from libertarians outside of the party in Colorado than just what we've offered. So I take that as a positive thing.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, very interesting times for sure. It's great seeing you and the other board members in the news getting reported on and making some national headlines. So very interesting stuff for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's nice. I think one article I was quoted and it was only one line, but it was the last line of the article. And I was like, great, I'll take that. That makes me feel good. My wife was like, did you see this? And I was like, no, but that actually feels really cool. It's like it's a reasonable quote, right? Like it's just a like, I understand this, but this is also very important. And that's it. So serious. I've heard libertarian make a comment that I thought was great, which was, I wasn't asked for the comment, but if you ever asked for comments, give a one sentence answer to a reporter. That way they can't take it out of context and they have to report it because it was the only sentence you gave them. So seems like
Oh,
it followed
nice.
that rule well.
Yeah, nice. That's definitely good advice. I'll have to remember that one. Well, Jacob, let's talk a little bit about the pledge. So,
Yeah.
how did the board develop the pledge?
So it actually kind of came out of what we've been doing with the GOP Liberty Pledge this past year, which has sort of evolved in our own. It sort of organically transitioned to a Liberty Pledge. There are a couple center party candidates. I don't remember which races. I think HT36 is one of them. I think. Don't quote me on that, but two that signed on board, which we were really supportive of. And so I think in the future, that's going to be more of a liberty pledge than just for a specific party. Now that I think we can make it more of a standard thing. But we got connected to RFK through the Libertarians for Kennedy. When we ultimately voted on taking Chase off the ballot, they then reached out to us and said, "Hey, the Kennedy campaign would like to talk to you. Are you interested?" We said, "Sure. We'll at least set up a meeting." It's not often a presidential campaign reaches out to you to talk, so we figured why not? Outside of your own. So we figured why not? And then we sat down, we had a nice conversation. It was just a few of us, as to not sort of overwhelm everything as we have a large board. We brought everything to the board. We had an executive session, I think, where we sort of talked about this. And what a lot of the members came back and said is, talk is cheap. We want some action. And while there's a lot of different ways we could potentially partner up, um, we wanted something sort of in good faith. And so a lot of members said, I know, like Kristen Steinke was one of them. There were, and Jordan Markovich, who's our comms director, brought this up too. We have this pledge we already made. Why don't we take the federal one, the one we gave for congressional candidates, and, present that. We looked at it and ultimately we said, let's change some things because the president does have some executive power authorities, some different authorities over the bureaucracy state, pardon abilities, things like that. Instead of I'll push for the pardoning, it's I will pardon X, Y, and Z. So we changed it a little bit and we sent it to Amaryllis, who is his niece and his campaign manager. She got back to us probably within a couple days and said, we like a lot of what we see. We're willing to get on board. We do have some changes, though. Can we make those or can we put those down in an email and send them back? And we were like, yeah, we want to take a look. And we were actually surprised at how little it was. The major changes were Department of Education, he was okay with abolishing, but under the circumstances of, coming from that, I think, more Democrat background and that sort of the blue dog Democrat sort of empathy that people kind of remember or think about, which was, okay, what about low income schools and rural schools whose states decide to ultimately ignore them? Or, there's all this other stipulations that could come. So ultimately it was his idea to change it. Why we agreed to it was he said, I want them to have access to some kind of federal funding. How we collect that, I don't know, but it comes with no stipulations. So no Michelle Obama, food program, no child left behind, none of this other garbage that just holds schools back. It's okay, you need money, you apply for this, probably a grant, you get it, you decide what's best to do with it. And then those people are leaders of the schools. If the school board screws it up, then the parents can go in and kick that school board out. But it's you're not tied to the teachers unions, you're not tied to all these other groups. The NFA, he was okay. It's seeming like abolishing the NFA. And I think ultimately, when it gets down to it, he's not going to lead a crusade to abolish the NFA. But if there was a bill that crossed his desk and it still banned chemical weapons and radiological weapons and, there are, a few things like that, that you're sort of like, okay, if I can get machine guns legal, I'm not going to fight over mustard gas, which is like a whole, philosophical idea of libertarianism that I just don't care to get into. Because if we've gotten to the point where machine guns are legal again and you can buy them in a Sears catalog, then it's the kind of America I want to be living in. And then the other thing that he actually added on to, which I was impressed, was the pardon list, because he said, I still want to make pardoning Julian Assange a big deal. They can't WikiLeaks has agreed, I think, to give up or censor some of the documents that they released. And Julian Assange has agreed with the guilty plea, I think, not to continue his work with WikiLeaks. I don't think they have to shut down, but he sort of just has to live the rest of his life, which if I were him, I'd probably do anyways. A pardon would allow the media and other organizations to get in there. You could make Julian Assange still the hero that he sort of deserves to be. I know Kennedy actually mentioned to us that he thinks there should be a national holiday where we celebrate whistleblowers who, are willing to stand up to the system. He definitely is from his work in New York, he is understandably very suspicious of corporations. And I will say, coming from New York with what he did in the Hudson River, it wasn't like I would argue actually a lot of the work that he did was good. He worked on behalf of smaller fisheries and smaller individual private businesses that against the government and GE because the GE were given monopolies over parts of the river by the New York State government in terms of them being the energy, electric and water monopoly. GE is a prime example of why making utilities a monopoly like we have for the common good has now turned out to be a completely bad thing because you have no competition. And so I can tell you, when I was young, for most of my life, like I never had to worry about how gross the Hudson was. When I was really young, it still was like, yeah, you don't want to swim in there. Now it's a really nice place again. And I think, libertarians in Colorado, this is something we understand. We don't always talk about it. There is a very valid argument for massive pollution violating the NAP because in Colorado, we have all of these rivers. And if you're upstream and you pollute the rest of the river and other people, the river flows through their land, then you are destroying part of their land. So I think that brings up a very valid point. So, he has members of his campaign that used to work on Ron Paul and Rand Paul's staff, Doug Stanford, helped on the campaign for like 6 months. He just left to go work on, a friend of his campaign, but he is getting that kind of influence. So I think he's even been pushed on, like, we didn't put the EPA in. And to be honest with you, part of it was just re-examining our federal pledge and seeing what small things we could change, what added things, what wording. We didn't put in things like the EPA. This kind of came with our GOP pledges. There is a very radical part of our platform and our positions that we aren't necessarily going to foister on other parties that we know they're just going to say no. These are things that they should stand by. So I'm probably not going to put on a pledge, hey, on a Republican pledge, like, you need to sign on to legalizing prostitution. Now, I think decriminalizing prostitution, especially in a future where sex robots might be a thing, and I see that as a very dangerous social, like, whatever you're going to do in the privacy of your own home is fine, but a young man having a sex robot is certainly very much worse for society than that young man going to a real person he still has to interact with and deal with a real person. But I'm not going to put that on there, but things that
Sure.
Republicans should get behind. So, but he seems to be going in that direction of wanting to get rid of the EPA in favor of the state organizations that handle that stuff. So,
Yeah, no, that makes
yeah.
sense, Jacob. Definitely. You gotta have something realistic, right? If you want somebody to sign the pledge, a candidate for office has to be somewhat aligned with their values. If you're trying to be totally contrary to their values, then of course, you're not going to get very far. So that does make a lot of sense. Let's take a look at the pledge
Yeah.
and we can go kind of through the rest of them here and see what RFK Jr. agreed to. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen and let's take a look here. All right. All right, there we go. Can you see that?
Yes, again.
Perfect. Perfect. So, presidential candidate pledge for liberty. Now, here we have the signed version. So, let's see. Maybe I could zoom in a little bit here for people out there. Yeah, pretty remarkable stuff. I mean, this is historic. Regardless of what people think, one way or the other, there's some criticism of RFK over some of his policies, but nonetheless, to get somebody of his stature, of his name, somebody out there who's, a legitimate contender for president, somebody who's possibly going to do very well. For him to, agree to the Libertarian Party of Colorado's principles on these issues is pretty impressive. So awesome, Jacob. Why don't you take us through the first one here?
Sure. So the first one is I will immediately work to pull funding for foreign military aid and push aggressively for peace negotiations for all foreign conflicts. So originally on our congressional pledge, it was pulling funding for the war in Ukraine and working toward peace for that. This makes it much more broad. Because there are a lot of places like Africa, for example, where we have troops where people have no idea and don't realize that. But it does also include places like Israel, because that's a big criticism of his is now, I mean, there's a lot of even internal fighting in the libertarians of should we really just be pushing for, pulling our money from Israel, doing what we would do with maybe other nations, trade or maybe not be a trade partner while they are, doing what they're doing in Gaza. As it is. I mean, I will admit that even when the beginning of this thing went on, I kind of hesitated to use the word genocide because I think there is a level there, but I think it definitely has gotten into that level. And he has not used that word, but it allows us for him to say, okay, like if nothing else, we cannot fund a country that is, at all. We shouldn't be giving our money to any, especially developed industrialized country. There's a good economic argument for not doing it in undeveloped countries as well, but certainly ones that are engaging in a, military action, especially ones where like for America, there really is no clear side. And I know that's where I fit is like being Jewish, like I do, understand the idea and like the idea of having a place where Jews feel like they can be safe and have a national religion. But you also had a whole group of people that live there and have gotten shifted around, and there are people who are old enough to remember, the when Israel was set up, and in both Israel and in Gaza and the West Bank. So I know for me, I don't know the solution. I have no idea, but I can at least agree to pull money. So this is actually kind of to corner RFK more in that direction of where we want him to be, specifically on Gaza, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and from a libertarian perspective, of course, peaceful coexistence with other people, with other nations, with other groups is such an important, I mean, cornerstone really of civilization itself.
Hmm.
Not just a libertarian principle, but a civilizational principle. So, one of the most important things a president does is the foreign policy positions they take and being commander in chief and really setting that military presence, setting the stage for a lot of that military intervention overseas for sure. Especially because Congress hasn't really declared war in recent memory. So the president kind of takes this unilateral action. So I think that's smart to have that as the first cornerstone of the pledge, or the first real line of the pledge there, to immediately work to pull funding for foreign military aid, push aggressively for peace negotiations for all foreign conflicts. Definitely, if people can't agree on that, then I don't know what we can't agree on. But that's a cornerstone. I think of every presidential candidate should agree to that, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Perfect. Let's move on here to the second line.
So the second is I oppose a military draft should any foreign conflicts escalate, which I actually think is really important. And I think I don't remember what the original line was. I actually think this is something he changed a little bit more to make it more aggressive than what it was before, because Congress just repassed the draft, which is until it happened something I didn't even know had a deadline to. It's just one of those things when you're about to turn 18, they tell you as a man, you need to sign up for selective service. You can be legal. I don't really know what happens if you don't sign up for it. But now all of a sudden, when you renew it, you're kind of like, okay, that's weird. What does that mean? And for him to say, okay, like I can't unilaterally, not make it a law, but I can say as president, like I will make sure and veto anytime the Congress tries to use the draft. I will not support a draft, which goes along with the libertarian ideology that conscription is slavery.
100% conscription is slavery. And, I got to think when you say the name Kennedy, of course, people think of the 60s. They think of that era, that kind of new frontier of Americanism. And of course, the Vietnam War is a huge part of that. And the draft, I mean, it's so tied in with the Kennedy era that, this makes sense. It fits so well with the narrative of RFK's campaign.
And the Libertarian Party was started not long after, I mean, like I think right before, not even a year before Saigon fell. And so, in the early speeches of the Libertarian Party, I mean, it's so close that they are still referring to the draft as our boys. We can't ever let our boys be drafted again and be put in this situation again. So, in some regard, I feel like, and that RFK is embodies the spirit of, probably what that feeling was for libertarians at that time.
Yeah. What's number three here, Jacob?
I will audit and reduce foreign aid spending. So I think I kind of mentioned that. I might have tied into one a little bit more what three here is. But again, it's, if he's going to audit and reduce foreign aid spending, I think that's great. Auditing, if nothing else, I mean, this is what bothered me in Colorado when the Republican who ran for treasurer didn't win a couple of years ago, was his entire platform was just, I want to audit stuff. That's it. I just want to audit the government. And people couldn't get behind that because it will show the massive waste in spending. And when everyone talks about the roads or parks or all of this, I think if everything was audited, I think you would need a fraction of what we were spending to really take care of this stuff. But I think also part of what he will struggle, or any president struggles, is I think there is a fair argument to be that there is waste in the government. I think there's also a big black budget in the government too. And sometimes when $3,000 is spent on a chair, 500 is probably spent on the chair, and the rest of it is given to the black budget so they can do whatever they do.
Yeah, definitely. No, very important there. Audit, reduce foreign aid spending for sure. Very, very important. Okay, number four, Jacob.
I will work to remove the presidential war powers and return those powers back to Congress. That was something I mean, like that was on our congressional, we changed it slightly, to take on the I as opposed to working with the president. But him signing on to that would be a really, a truly tremendous thing, to scale that kind of power back.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that's one of the biggest travesties I think in modern politics is where we have this imperial presidency where they can, like we said, basically de facto declare war by deploying troops and sending people overseas. I mean, we saw it so much in our lifetimes, and it's really unfortunate that Congress hasn't stepped up and ensured that they're the only ones who can actually declare war. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
very, very important point there. All right, number five.
I will recognize the egregious abuses by the U.S. intelligence agencies and work toward reducing their power with the end goal of abolishing them entirely. So I know there's been a lot of criticism. Actually, on the presidential pledge, we've gotten no criticism. It was the Republican pledge we got criticism, and I will admit that probably it could have been slightly worded better. We're not saying we want no spy agencies and stuff. What we're saying is the CIA is not really run by the US government. It's a private organization that has been sanctioned by the government to do foreign spying for us. And again, it's not a free market solution where, there are free market spy agencies, but the CIA is the one that really gets the monopoly on it by the government. And Kennedy is the only person that is saying in these interviews to people who are normal that, hey, I'm pretty sure the CIA killed my uncle over everything that was going on. That's a massively bold thing to say. And one of our members had an argument with someone in another state where that guy said, well, everyone knows that. But no, I don't think they do. I think a lot of people live in a world where if you have maybe heard of it, it's a conspiracy that the CIA killed him. But there are a lot of people who don't know this stuff. Just like we didn't put it on this list, and I didn't think about it till afterward. But if I had a conversation with Kennedy and or Trump or Biden or any of these people who are serious about winning some random people, you know what you do? You declassify the Epstein list. It doesn't have to be everyone who flew on the plane every time, but people who went to that island enough, like you have some real cojones and you do that, and then you'll get a bunch of kids who don't really know enough, but they know that Epstein didn't kill himself and they get that joke that would
Yeah.
get on board with things like that.
Oh, 100%. I think that's one of the most attractive things about the Kennedy presidential campaign, for me at least, is seeing somebody who really has a personal drive to kind of end the abuse of these intelligence agencies and these basically secret police organizations that we have operating within our country off the taxpayer dime. Very dangerous organizations threatening world peace. I mean,
Yep.
responsible for so many horrendous crimes. And I really do believe Kennedy's probably the only person out there who has the drive, the motivation, and a real good personal reason to actually do something about it.
And I don't think he's the only candidate who would do this. I just think he's the only candidate that, I mean, like, it's probably a slim chance of him winning anyways, but a candidate who can make a dent and put that in more of the popular narrative, which I think is good. And I think it's probably safe for him to not chase the Democratic nomination because how many years ago was a Democratic nomination? It was the convention in Chicago during the summer of violence, and Bobby Kennedy was killed, and there was all those murders outside in Chicago that happened. It was a giant mess. I know a lot of people are already, I mean, Chicago has its own rough places. I don't know where the convention is going to be, but everyone is expecting that same kind of stuff, and so it is weird. It is weird, this kind of stuff rhyming again, it's some testament that the older generations, like the silent generation and the greatest generation, have had a hold of American politics for so long that what the baby boomers sort of experienced when they were young is maybe not coming back, but it's certainly, I mean, we talk to baby boomers now where they're like, oh, I've never really felt like I've been represented that much in American politics. And arguably, in some ways, they haven't by age. So
Yeah,
it's interesting.
it is interesting. Yeah, history does rhyme, that's for sure. All right, number six.
I will include auditing the Federal Reserve in my 4-year plan. I think that's really good. I've heard him in interviews say he would consider someone like Ron Paul to head the Federal Reserve, which would be fantastic. And if all he does is audit this, if people understand, and I think for a lot of normal people who don't even know about it, um, it's an easier sell of look at how bad this is. Now we have proof on paper, and here are other solutions of like, hey, it's not actually as scary as you think to have multiple banks, or even, in some regard, the US, again, just like the CIA, has this weird twisted relationship where the Federal Reserve is a bunch of private banks that sort of act like our national bank. It's not even technically a national bank where the government, prints money, but the Fed has a lot of independent power to do its own thing as well.
Definitely. I mean, definitely, you think of the Ron Paul years, 08 and 12, in the Fed. all the chants for end the Fed and all of that. So great to see this continuing and becoming more closer to reality than ever. You know, with
Mm-hmm.
Representative Massey, Thomas Massey out of Kentucky, sponsoring a bill to end the Federal Reserve, and to be able to get the presidential candidates talk seriously about auditing it and hopefully ending it, I think is a good step forward for sure.
Being able to backtrack on anything the federal government has done would be such a white pill to so many of us. Because I mean, like, that's why I feel defeated even on the Affordable Care Act. Is you're like, it hasn't been passed for that long, and when I was a Republican, we voted then the House, the Senate, and then the presidency with Donald Trump, and they didn't need to replace it. All they had to do was repeal it, and they couldn't repeal it. And so it showed, I mean, Social Security is still around. It just shows you how difficult it is to unentrench the government from things once they get their fingers into it.
Definitely. Number seven.
I will prioritize reducing the size of government and funding of all three-letter agencies, which is great. I was going to say, even if not everything is abolished, but it's reduced. Like you reduce. He likes the EPA, but if you reduce it to the point where okay, the feds are saying, listen, if the state government is completely refusing, and the state is allowing a massive corporation to poison all of its farms and its water and all of that, and the State Department refuses to step in, maybe you have a federal agency be able to. Although I would argue, I have a best friend, and his dad worked for the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York, and he hated the EPA. And he would tell you the states always do a better job of it than the EPA will do.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. But yeah, I mean, I think libertarianism as an ideology or as a set of values or principles will win when every presidential candidate, regardless of party, especially you think of RFK, somebody with a Democratic background coming out and saying, agreeing to prioritize reducing the size of government and
Yep.
reducing that funding of three-letter agencies. I mean, that's a massive win. That's something that if all the presidential candidates got behind, I think then you could say liberty's winning.
I mean, we'll get to the pardons, but this is the thing with Ross Ulbricht. Outside of Joe Biden, who obviously played some role in probably really, the deal with releasing Julian Assange. He's the only one who hasn't said he would release Ross Ulbricht. So that's probably a win. Theoretically, now any of the people who win, that will be at the top of their charts, and that will be a great thing. No matter who does that, will have my thanks. Just like I am, I mean, we need to change the guilty verdict with Assange, but him getting home to be home with his family is better than him rotting in a jail cell.
Definitely. So I can see number eight here, you already mentioned, has been edited.
Yes.
Seems like it because it is so a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more detailed, not as quite of a straightforward. So let's go ahead and read the first part here, and then we can talk about that, and then move on to page two of the pledge.
Yeah, absolutely. I will return education back to local control. In the 1960s and 70s, the United States consistently ranked number one in the education of its children among all nations. Since the creation of the Department of Education in 1979, the federal government has spent billions, approximately 50 billion annually, and we now rank 22. We have failed generations of American children who cannot read or do math at grade level. It's time to admit defeat and encourage the states to try. Um, a hand at rebuilding better. For most of my life, I strongly supported the Department of Education. I now recommend its abolition, except for research functions. Federal education subsidies for poor and rural schools will come with no strings attached in order to preserve local autonomy. And I do really appreciate that he used that phrase, like preserve local autonomy, because local autonomy is just, I mean, like that was nothing I even thought about in the world of politics until I moved to Colorado. Because New York, you just don't have as much home rule on stuff. We just don't have as many unique cultures of people. Like it's New York City, and Long Island is a little different. And then a lot of people upstate like that are pretty much the same. Colorado, like the mountain ranchers and the plains ranchers, are not the same type of people. Colorado Springs is very, very different from Denver, or Boulder is very, very different. So, um, I really appreciate that, and it's because we specifically said to him, because he said back to us like, I want to abolish the Department of Education. I can't get on board, but I'm not, here are my fears. And we said, okay, local autonomy is what we care about. And so he kept that part in the pledge, at least, which we appreciated.
Yeah, very interesting. He definitely went to length to explain himself and to not backtrack on previous positions, and especially, you think of government education as part of the Kennedy dynasty for sure, in terms of that kind of thought process back in the 60s, and this idea of, giving children equal opportunity and things like that. So very interesting to see him kind of explain himself a little bit more in depth here. But that key line there, I now recommend its abolition except for its research functions. I'm not too familiar with the research functions of the Department of Education. I can kind of put together what that might be, but interesting that that would be the one thing he sees value in. And then of course, I know that's a little bit of nuance there that not all libertarians would agree with, but the federal education subsidies for poor urban and rural schools will come with no strings attached. But of course, then that
Yeah.
that line there at the end is what brings the libertarians back in, right? In order to preserve local autonomy. So here's the purpose, here's the meaning,
And
here's
I
where he's
mean,
at. Yeah.
right. I mean, like he used to very much strongly support it. So he's not a libertarian. He's not clear cut on a lot of this stuff. And even libertarians argue all the time. There are ones who people consider themselves libertarian who do support NATO existing. And I particularly don't care if NATO exists. I just don't want the US to be part of NATO. And something it needs to be disbanded altogether. So, we've pulled him in a good direction. And I will it's a lot better than honestly what I thought we were going to get. I really thought he was going to send half of it back and say, these are things I just am, even if I agree with it in spirit, can't sign on for the public. And all they asked was, hey, we will sign this. We only ask just, if this gets released, we want to be on board of when you're releasing it so no one gets blindsided. And to be honest with you, Dave Williams kind of blindsided us with what we talked about, where he released everything to the media before we had a chance to even know what was going on. So I appreciate the partnership there of not trying to blindside the other group.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, for sure. It's nice to see that the partnership really actually being a partnership, right?
Yeah.
All right. So you talked a little bit about number nine, but maybe
Mm-hmm.
just real quick, Julian Assange is free. Just maybe quickly, why does this matter? And of course, if you want to just briefly cover that real quick.
Sure. So he wanted to say, I uphold freedom of the press by pardoning Julian Assange. For Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, it's good to have a pardon because that information can be more widely distributed. But he wanted to say freedom of the press because he wants it to be sure that journalists should be able to investigate things the government is doing without fear of government oppression. And that clearly is not happening anymore in the United States. As we go into the others, you'll notice each one is a little different, kind of describing based on the pardons to explain why they are being pardoned and how that is, expanding freedom for people.
Oh, interesting. That's a good point. I didn't notice that the first time I read through this. So yeah, upholding freedom of the press by pardoning Julian Assange. So it's not just about Julian Assange; it's about freedom of the press. So I definitely appreciate
Exactly.
that.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about number 10 here.
Which is I will protect whistleblowers by pardoning Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Reality Winner, and others. So Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning are the more famous. I don't remember off the top of my head what Reality Winter was convicted of. I do remember though, as soon as I looking up, I never knew who Reality Winner was, but I remember looking it up and going, "Oh wow, this is absolutely a cause libertarians should be championing." And again, to protect whistleblowers, to say you should be able to come out and tell the evil things that your government is doing. If we were in the middle of a war and you go and you say, "Hey, here are all these troop movements, and this is what we're doing, and here's where our spies are," and someone is obviously a declared enemy of ours, that's a whole different thing. But there are so many things the government is willing to toss its citizens aside for in the name of quote national security. And FISA has now gotten worse because of our speaker being the bad deciding vote on that. So, if you will not have an Edward Snowden situation under an RFK presidency. And I would hope that I know with the Libertarian candidate Chase Oliver, you wouldn't, and I would hope under a Trump presidency that would be the same as well.
Yeah, whistleblowing definitely important. How can we claim to have a democratic or representative government if the people don't know what the government is doing? How can the people make informed decisions to decide policy? Because ultimately, that power should rest with the people. So,
Mhm.
100%, whistleblowers need more protection for sure. Let's slide
And
this up here.
obviously, we've seen with like Chevron getting removed that even RFK will be much more limited as president, and his agencies would be much more limited than they are before. So, you have clearly a better, generally for the most part, better court. This one is I will protect internet and transactional freedom by pardoning Ross Ulbricht. I think this is really great because most people don't know what the Silk Road was and think he endorsed hitmen and drug stuff. Actually, the hitman thing fell apart in court because it was proven that wasn't true. But it really, now that Facebook Marketplace exists, people get it when you talk about it of, well, if you went and sold drugs on Facebook Marketplace, is that Facebook's fault? Well, no, right, exactly. And so protecting your internet freedom and transactional freedom, meaning what you transact between one person and another really shouldn't be the government's business. I think you could broaden that to a lot of great things, but I'm sure he's not quite expanding it to that far, but maybe we can get, if he wins or gets more media attention, we can get those talking points out of, yeah, maybe the government shouldn't be involved in anything like your $600 Venmo transactions now that we tax.
110%. So perfect. Let's move on to 12. So this is often a criticism of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is his previous anti-gun positions. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about 12 here.
I will always protect and uphold the right to bear arms. I will veto and otherwise move to abolish all unconstitutional gun laws. And I don't think he quite understands how far that's going to, but the rest of us do, and we're happy for that. His niece Amaryllis. Now this is where I know it spooks libertarians as kind of the conspiracy people we are. She joined the CIA in 2002 after 9/11, worked there until 2012. She then, I think, was on her own. She worked with the democratic forces in Myanmar that democratically took over. I don't know if it was democratic or not, but like supposedly the people who want more freedom and liberty and democracy. Do you remember that TikTok video or online video from a few years ago of the girl? She's like dancing and the military trucks are like going in the background to take over the government. Her group were the people that lost the government that day. Well, they've been in the mountains of Myanmar 3D printing guns fighting the totalitarian military. And so she went all on about 3D printing guns and how she is pushing RFK. And there are a lot of people pushing RFK Jr. To be better with guns. And I think he's understanding. And he has been engaging in a lot more minority communities. And I think people are surprised when they do that to find out how strongly minorities have guns. And you can say, well, legal ownership is very low. That's legal ownership. There are a lot of people who don't trust the government enough to want to buy legal guns, which I can kind of understand.
Oh,
Or,
yeah, completely.
yeah, or I'm sure if you live in bad neighborhoods too, like, do you want to be the guy who everyone knows went to, I don't know, is on some list somewhere where, you get a hold of it, who has a gun and who to, not break into. I don't know. Like there's just a lot of drawbacks to that. So I'm glad he's moving in the right direction. And so I'll take it.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. No, getting Democrats supporting our Second Amendment rights. I mean, that's a win right there. I mean, that's ultimately how liberty wins. Republicans are mostly good on guns, not always, unfortunately. Democrats mostly bad on guns, sometimes good. But yeah, just moving everybody a little bit better on these positions is definitely moving in the right direction for freedom and
My
liberty.
experience with Republicans, especially things like guns, having been one, is when you get to a state level, not always, but a lot of the states, the Republicans are a lot better on those issues. When you get to the national level, it's such a different game that everyone is so much more conservative fundraising and losing the seats, than being able to do anything.
Perfect. So perfect, perfect. If you want to talk about number 13 here.
I will support and uphold the freedoms afforded to the American people as set forth by the founding fathers in the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, which I like. I think that's going back to a better place. I know there's a whole conversation between the Articles of Confederation and Constitution, but for our purposes and the direction we want to go, I think it is a generalized statement, but the freedoms afforded to the American people are pretty clear in the Constitution. And it's pretty clear that they are not provided by the government. They are endowed to us by either God, or if you don't believe in God, there are a lot of logical reasons why you have a freedom to defend yourself and a freedom to think your own thoughts, and, things that you don't need a theological God to explain why you need a right to privacy and things like that. Like, if you think about it long enough, it makes sense. So I appreciate him getting on board, and he has talked about the privacy thing. He talked to us about that privately, and I really appreciate that. There are a lot of a lot of random Americans I've talked to who are more concerned about their loss of privacy with the government.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, yeah, no, it's a great line. It's a good kind of summary of everything there, kind of adhering to these constitutional American freedom, founding father type principles. So hard to argue there. Really great to see this pledge here at the bottom. By signing this pledge, I commit to uphold these principles and actions as a presidential candidate for the Colorado Libertarian Party in the 2024 election, acknowledging that these actions are the best way to make America a freer and more prosperous country. And there's the
Mhm.
signature there on June 27th, 2024. So definitely historic, and real kudos to the board of the Libertarian Party of Colorado for making this happen. I mean, for being such a powerful force in politics to get somebody like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to make this agreement, to make this partnership and say, hey, I'll adhere to libertarian values if we can work together to kind of advance liberty overall. So really good
Yep.
stuff, Jacob. Yeah, what are some final thoughts here?
This was his way of trying to reach out to libertarians, no matter what happens one way or another. And I think everybody should, unless you really, really love Joe Biden and it being a blue state, everyone else should be kind of excited because the margin of difference now is about 1.9% in the polls, which is well within the margin of error. It's very likely that Colorado is going to be a swing state. And so I think Kennedy will absolutely decide the fate of Colorado one way or another. It's interesting because in one-way polls, he beats both candidates. Those are polls funded by him, but it's kind of interesting. I've seen him now hold pretty steadily as 10% in the national polls. So I would imagine if he can hit some crazy number like 20, I think that will give people the confidence to actually come out for him. I think if he stays probably at 10, maybe even gets to 15, I think there are a lot of people that are going to say, the guy's not going to win. It's not worth voting for. He needs that higher polling. He needs to be on more ballots to give people the confidence of, oh wow, this is an independent that can actually make a major difference. And if he changes ballot access laws for people, if he's already helping to fund the Reform Party in Florida, if he's genuine about his desire to help those of us that are not the Uniparty be set up for the future to fight the Uniparty, then America is going to be in a better place come 4 years after this is all over.
Definitely well said, Jacob. And I got to say, too, it is just a wonderful sign of the times that the libertarians, the Libertarian Party, is drawing so much interest and so much attention and being such a powerful political force. I mean, you have former President Donald Trump going to the Libertarian Party National Convention, asking for the vote, really reaching out to the Libertarian people, the community, trying to gain this vote. Robert F. Kennedy doing the same thing. And, maybe the libertarians are really going to be the ones who are some of the deciding factors in some of these elections going forward. And that's a great thing to see, if that can be leveraged to make these candidates, these politicians, these office holders more liberty minded or more liberty oriented in general. I mean, we're definitely moving in the right direction. So kudos to you, kudos to the board, and really appreciate all your hard work. And, I know it's not easy facing some of the criticism and everything else out there, but you're making waves, making a difference, and definitely appreciate that.
No problem. We're getting, I think, far more love from people than we are hate. And I have no desire to leave the Libertarian Party. I think this will set us up for, I think, someone that ultimately will very much unify the party in 2028. And if we're in a better spot where we've had a lot of name recognition from someone like RFK and libertarians can work on the campaign and learn how to really canvass and set up all these alternate groups and set up PACs and get all this other stuff up and running, then the person that I think has probably now been driven to 20 running in 2028 will come out with an absolute bang, and that's my like 4 year goal right now, so 4 or 5 year goal, whatever it is.
Awesome. And great to see libertarians forming coalitions and working with other people who are maybe liberty adjacent, but not necessarily pure libertarians, because, who really is? So
Right. And thank you, Brandon, for this and all the work you do, man. Like you work really hard. And you are also what I really appreciate is you are very willing and open to talk and working with everybody as well. There are a few media personalities, which I include you as a media personality, who, really encapsulate that spirit of partisanship that a lot of Coloradans talked about that was here for a long time in this state. So I appreciate you always being a friend.
Awesome, Jacob. Well, hey, I appreciate that, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Absolutely.
But best wishes. Thank you very much for your time, and take care, Jacob.
Take care. Bye.